Hey everybody, today's video is going to focus on some dynamics processing. So talking about things like compression and gating, different kinds of things that we've done before, and of course are super important to cleaning up our audio and making sure that everything sounds its best. So we're going to be using gates on a couple of different tracks in order to prevent some unwanted audio from coming through. We're going to block it with a gate and then only allow the gate to open up when the desired sound comes through. I'm thinking about things like this vocal track up here. If I solo the vocals, you can see just by looking at the waveform that you've got plenty of sound here, but then when the waveform gets bigger, that's when the actual vocals come in. So if we listen to this, we can hear drums and guitar. And then finally the voice comes in. Now we're not going to be able to get rid of the guitar and the drums behind the voice when it's there, but we can effectively shut the rest of this down. Instead of having to edit out those parts, we can just use a gate to sort of block out that stuff in between when the vocals are actually singing. So that's one of the things that we're going to do. And then we're going to compress some things. Again, the vocals, and a couple of the drum elements. And there's two reasons why we might compress things. We're either going to try to even out and make a performance a little bit more consistent in regards to volume, and then we can boost up some makeup gain to make it sound a little bit more substantial. But then the other thing that we can do is take something like this kick drum and just tame it a little bit so it's not as harsh, so we can just sort of like condense it down and make sure that it doesn't peak quite as much. So we can do those types of things, and then we just have to keep in mind what is the order of operations for these kinds of things. So we started with EQ, then should we compress or should we add a gate? So we'll explore why we would do one thing before or after the other. So I think one of the first things that I'm going to do is go look at the kick drum, because this one is going to require the least amount of like fixing. You can tell that a microphone is placed right in front of the kick drum. And we've already eliminated, looking at our EQ, we've already eliminated some of the high frequency sound that might be getting in the way there. So we should have a pretty clean kick drum sound. Alright, so there's like a little bit of snare rolls and some guitar just in there a little bit, but not too bad. So what I'm going to do is add a compressor here. So plugin and dynamics. The Dynamics 3 compressor limiter is the stock Pro Tools plugin that you would have. Now, I may not have mentioned this before when we're working with EQ, but there's no shame in using a preset as long as you keep in mind that presets were made in general and that we might have to tweak a preset in order for it to work best for our specific situation. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go to the presets and look for something about kick, and let's keep it tight. So it's going to change some settings around for me, and I should be able to hear those. I listen to before and after. Now you can see how much gain reduction I'm getting is peaking down here around -8 or so. So I'm losing, my output is lower than my input. And that's what we expect from a compressor, but I can add some extra output gain. Effectively bump that up to about 8, which is what I'm seeing the reduction at. So as long as I'm not clipping at the end of this, so back off a little bit. I'm just going to back off until I know I'm no longer distorting. Then I can keep resetting this here. And then before and after. See, it just sounds slightly more full when we do it this way. So you see, I'm using a preset to get there, and then I'm just making some little tweaks to make it specific to my sound here. Okay, so I'm done with the kick drum, really. And snare drum is the other element that I'm going to do the same to. Now, what you have to remember about the snare is that there is a little bit of like this, these like rim things happening at the beginning in addition to the regular snare hits. So we have to make sure that what we do here for the majority of the song is also, has a good effect on this area here. So let's listen. Again, we're going to add a compressor. And I guess it's worth saying now that we're not going to add a compressor to every single track like we did with the EQ. EQ is used as like a cleanup tool for every single thing that we've got here. Compression is only necessary on, you know, certain elements. So I'm not going to add compression on my drum overheads, or I'm probably going to leave the toms alone, and I'll leave the bass and the guitar alone because those look like very consistent sounds. So I'm really only going to use it on kick, snare, and vocals. And, you know, there's no wrong answer there, but that seems to make the most sense to me. I might add it on the saxophone, actually, just because saxophone players have a tendency to sort of have a lot of movement when they perform, so moving in and out of the area of the microphone. All right, so back to the snare. Choosing a snare compressor. And let's hear what that sounds like. So a little bit of compression happening here. If I wanted more compression to happen, I could lower my threshold. That will make compression start a little sooner, and then I could bump up the ratio just a little bit to make that compression a little bit more intense. And again, now I have a little room to add makeup gain. But again, the point is to not peak. So I'm going to just add about 2 dB of makeup gain, maybe even a little less. Alright, so we're looking pretty good here. Pretty happy with that sound. And you know, one easy way to sort of check out how everything is doing, and the changes that you're making are positive, I should be able to select all my different tracks by holding Shift, and then holding Shift and Shift Option Command. I'm going to be able to turn off, you know, every one of, I'm basically bypassing all of these plugins when they turn that color. So Shift Option to apply what I'm doing to all selected tracks, and then hold Command also, or Control on PC, and then I'm able to turn off each like section of plugins with just 2 clicks. I can turn them all off. So here's what our song sounded like before. And now with our effects. So you might hear that things just, it's subtle, but we're sort of just removing tiny little pieces from each element, and we're starting to exaggerate a couple others. So we're just cleaning some things up at this point. And then you're going to really start to hear some differences once we get into panning and volume adjustments. Okay, so you could, you know, perform these sorts of things on all sorts of, you know, whatever you decide is necessary. But again, I'm saying that probably vocals, kick, snare, and saxophone is where I'm going to use compression in here and on everything. But then I'm looking at things like my toms, and there's only a couple moments when those are even used. So those look like good places to add a gate to me. So I'm going to go ahead and add from Dynamics the Dynamics 3 expander gate that you have access to. And I'm going to solo these toms. Just tom 1 to begin with. So what I'm doing right now is just listening to see if anything passes this threshold. Alright, so I can hear like a snare drum every once in a while peek through there. And the more I raise up my threshold, the less I'm going to hear. So I want to fast forward sort of to one of these areas where I see, and just make sure that that tom actually comes through. But I want to hear the whole thing. Right, so it's a little bit tricky, so I'm going to kind of just apply the same settings to my other tom. So I'm going to hold Option and click and drag, and then I've got the same plugin with the same exact settings. So now I should have a relatively quiet, you know, except for when the cymbals crash a little hard or something like that, but I'm not too concerned about little things like that. I'm just cleaning it up in broad strokes. And that's pretty cool that I'm able to clean that stuff up relatively well. So if I add that back into the mix and listen to the whole thing. I think that sounds really nice. It's cleaned it up just a little bit, and when it's, might sound a little bit abrupt or something when it's on its own, but when you put it in the mix with everything else and you consider that the overheads are allowing for some of that sound to reverberate in the space, then I think we're doing really well. So dynamics on some of the things that need it, especially vocals, the kick and the snare to sort of like even those out, and the saxophone just because that guy's moving around a lot, and then some gates on the things that there's not a lot of actual wanted sound except for very specific moments that can be useful for you. Okay, so dynamics processing this time, and we'll move on to volume and panning adjustments next time. Thanks a lot.